Hi everyone, I'm Tom. This is Watercolour Bites and I'm very excited to share a video packed full of information and hopefully great inspiration, so let's take a look. Thanks for joining me. For this video I've called in the help of 7 other artists. I gave them all free rein to interpret the question, what's your top tip or tips for watercolour, or what do you wish you'd known when you started out? And I purposely didn't tell anyone what the other tips that had come up already were. I wanted to see if there were any recurring themes. Plus every single artist has a completely different angle or a completely different way of explaining things. So see if you can pick out some of the recurring themes, and I would of course love to hear in the comments what your favourites are. I've put various links to all of the artists in this video. Please do check them all out, show them some support. I'm super excited to get into this with you, and we're going to kick off with an artist whose YouTube channel I highly recommend. For me, Liron perfectly combines a real commitment to analysing the nitty-gritty aspects of watercolour, those important underlying principles of all aspects of it, but always alongside a real passion and a total joy for the medium and a drive to push forward and evolve his own work. So let's take it away, Liron.
Hey, what's up, Liron here. I want to share with you 2 quick watercolor tips. We're gonna go one that's very brainy and another one that's very practical. Let's start with the brainy one. So watercolor is all about painting and painting and painting and never stopping and always painting, because you want to learn how to control the medium until it becomes intuitive. So many of the trouble people face, so many of the struggles that I hear from people in questions and messages that I get on the YouTube channel, on Instagram, everywhere is about how do I do this kind of a technique? How do I avoid this kind of a thing? All of the answers come down to you have to continuously practice until watercolor becomes second nature, until painting plus water plus paint becomes second nature. You know exactly how to get the kind of result you want. Then you can start working on developing your vision and improving that aspect. But first, you have to paint as much as you can, run through pages, run through materials, and just do it. Use cheap materials if you have to, but you have to get going and get into motion. Now, the second tip is to always have one of these on hand, a water sprayer. That's the practical tip for today. This is just key. As soon as the painting starts to dry, if you're having trouble, if you're in a hurry always and you're worried about your washes drying, just use one of these and you'll be able to give it some more time, allow yourself some more time to work slowly and remove a lot of the pressure that you may experience. So these are my 2 tips. Hope you enjoyed these.
2 great tips. Thanks so much, Liron. Really appreciate this burst of energy to kick us off. A spray bottle is incredibly useful, and I could not agree more with simply spending time with a brush in your hand. And the kind of emotional and mental side of painting is so important, and in many ways it's the harder side of painting, or at least the more elusive and less tangible side, the harder side to teach. It's the ups and downs that can be such an emotional roller coaster. They're one that's well worth riding, and commitment to just getting down to some painting, getting comfortable with the medium, it's going to get you a long way. I've put links to Liron's channel in the description. If you are after videos packed full of information and inspiration, do be sure to check them out. One of the most wonderful things about being an artist that I have found is actually the other artists. It's so fun and life-affirming to connect with like-minded people, and my next guest, if you want to call them that, Julia, I think is a bit of a kindred watercolour spirit, both in terms of subject and also what we love about the medium.
Hello, hi, my name is Julia Cassels. I'm a wildlife artist. Welcome to my studio. I've been painting in watercolour for well over 25 years now, both here in England and over in Africa, where we lived for many years. I'd like to talk to you about my favourite top tips for watercolour, of which there are many, although I do feel there are about 4 really key ones. So before you start, just take some time to really look at your subject, looking for the lightest areas, the darkest areas. You're making decisions before you even pick up a paintbrush, so that when you do go for it, your work will look much more instinctive, it will flow, and it will seem effortless, which is what we're all trying to achieve. Secondly, the unpainted areas in your painting, the bits of paper which are untouched with paint or water, are as important as the painted areas. They form a contrast, they cause a zestiness and a zing, and they cause the painted areas to absolutely sing. Your work will appear more lively, more vibrant, and there'll be a little added sense of drama to your work. Thirdly, the paintbrush. I've got two here. I use a number 16 and a number 8 almost the entire time. I like to hold my brush at arm's length. I also like to stand to work, and I hold my brush very much at the end of the handle, so it allows me my whole arm and I can move it around, and I have so much more freedom. I'm not constricted. And finally, when you're not sure where to go next with your work, stop. Put it down, come and look at it later, or even the next day or the day after. It's always so tempting to go in and fiddle into the semi-dry paint, and that's when mistakes can happen. It's much easier to build up a second layer than it is to go in and just kind of do something you might regret later. I'd like to say also that watercolour is the most exciting and extraordinary medium. It's so versatile, you can take it anywhere, it's brilliant for travelling. It dries quickly, it's spontaneous, it's immediate. But above all, it has this luminosity which is totally unique. You can put one layer and put a second layer on top of it and let the first layer glow through. You can watch on wetted paper how colours merge and blend together. No other medium does this, which is an absolute joy. Allow the watercolour to do what it does best, but above all, enjoy it.
Isn't it awesome to hear from someone who's been painting in watercolour for 25 years and is still so full of passion and enthusiasm for the medium? It comes across so clearly, and for me, Julia really sums up the pure joy of watercolour. Next up we have Jake. You will see straight away that Jake is clearly used to concisely cutting to the bottom line of various aspects of the medium and actually painting in general in a very direct and easy to understand way.
Hi everyone, I'm Jake. I'm an artist and tutor. I'm so pleased that Tom has asked me to share some tips with you, as watercolour is one of my favourite mediums. Watercolours have a reputation of being difficult to use, but luckily for us, they can be easily tamed. First off, invest in good materials. This is especially true with paper. I recommend using thick, 100% cotton, cold pressed paper. Something like this. Got Arches, Sanders, or the Langton Prestige. It will help you control the paint much easier than with a cheaper pad. Painting with poor materials is like going into battle without a sword. Spend time studying the fundamentals. Practice your drawing skill by sketching from observation. Remember, when you're painting, you're also drawing, and it's good to be observing all the way through the process. Learn how to see values by painting in monochrome. Set up a simple still life with objects from around your home with a desk lamp to light them. This will help you understand how light and shadow fall on simple objects. Then when you go to paint something more complex, you can simplify what you see with your knowledge of these shapes. Something else that often goes overlooked is edges. Edges are great for guiding your viewer around a painting. For example, sharp edges draw the eye towards them. Be aware of your edges and learn how to soften them using wet and wet techniques. Using a variety of edges will bring your paintings to life. So these are the must-have building blocks. You could also include colour, but it's less important when you're starting out. So to recap, observation, values, and edges. They're your fundamentals. Learn to choose a good reference. So painting from life is the best, but when working from a photo, you'll want to pick a reference that has a good amount of shadow. Shadow helps to describe form to the viewer. A good test for this is by squinting your eyes or by making the image into a small thumbnail on your PC. And if your subject still reads well, that's the sign of a great reference. And my last tip is to use the qualities of watercolour to your advantage. By that I mean using a big brush, lots of water, and create flowing, expressive marks. You'll have to plan ahead and paint from light to dark to get the most out of your watercolours. But don't be too precise when copying a photo. Aim to put your emotional response on the page. Be expressive and have fun. I hope that helped, and I'll see you soon.
I love all those points. Cheers, Jake. Jake has an up-and-coming channel much like myself, and a good online presence in general. He's a great teacher, so don't forget all of the links to the artists are in the description. Please do consider checking them out and showing them support. Next up, I'm very excited to hear from Tori. I've been a big fan of Tori's work for a long time, and she was a totally inspiring and very funny guest on the podcast. The links to the podcast and that particular episode are below. Let's take a look.
Hello, Hello, my name is Tori Ratcliffe and I'm a wildlife and pet portrait artist. I work with watercolour but also with ink and fine liner pen. My advice for those who are trying with watercolours is that you don't have to use them in the traditional way. I certainly don't. I really struggled with getting to grips with the traditional way of painting with them. So I sort of developed my own way of using them, which is where I incorporated the fine liner. I also definitely don't use the same consistencies as traditionally. I often use a lot thicker watercolour, and people sometimes say to me, you know, oh, how do you get that really thick white bit on the dots of the eye? And I'm like, it's just watercolour, you just don't need to add water all the time. My other bit of advice would be that less can often be more. Thinking about not overworking the paint or feeling the need to put too much on the paper. What I've learned over the years is when you're near the finish line, put it away and look at it the next day and with fresh eyes, and you actually might find that you don't need to do anything else to it. And also, don't strive to be 100% perfect. It's fine to strive for 85% or 90% happy with a piece of work. Because as the artist, you're always going to be looking with a fine-tooth comb, with a magnifying glass to think, oh, is it finished? What else needs tweaked to get it perfect? And the reality is nobody's looking at it with that lens except you. So you don't need to strive for 100% because your version of 85% perfect is probably 100% to somebody else.
I purposely asked Tori not only because of her work, but also for the reason that she mentions, which is using the medium in her own way. It just shows that ultimately there are no rules. Yes, we touch on the foundational principles a lot and the joys of the medium, but ultimately find your own ways of doing things and paint in a way that pleases you and brings you joy above all else. And of course, going easy on the self-criticism is so important. Yes, we need to look at things with a discerning eye, but not aiming for 100% perfection in your eyes is going to save a lot of heartache. Thanks, Tori. Love those. Okay, we've got 3 more artists. Next up is someone whose work instantly grabbed me when I saw it a few years ago. It was so interesting to see what Karen had to say, and it made so much sense hearing her journey in relation to her work.
Hi Tom, thanks for having me on board your artist top tips for watercolours. I'm a self-taught artist, so I've got no formal background to speak of, so much of my work is a result of trial and error. And when I first started working in watercolours, frankly they were so bad I'm surprised I even pursued it. But my biggest problem was backgrounds. They were my nemesis. So my tip to you is how to make your backgrounds a bit more interesting. Mine to begin with were flat, overworked and just downright boring. And I'm not an artist who likes to paint in great detail. So when I saw a watercolour tip using salt to make the background more interesting and also cling film, I developed a technique where I actually combined the use of them both. In this painting of a Namibian elephant coming out of some riverine bush, the 2 tricks combined worked a treat to indicate the vegetation behind him. Had I painted every detail of the background, I think it would have totally detracted from the energy and forward motion coming from the elephant himself. I've used the same combination in this painting of Fighting Zebra also. A sprinkling of salt on a still wet wash works for all sorts of effects. I've always got a small bottle of it when I go out sketching in the field. Strategically placed, it works to indicate vegetation as well as it works to indicate sunlight on water, for instance. The next tip I have is saving time when going out in the field, where preparing a background before you even set out can give you some really interesting pieces to take home with you. Mostly I do use a watercolour sketchbook, but if I'm out on a long trip, I cut up small pieces of watercolour paper, which I tape to a board, wash on a combination of colours. I like to stick to 3 or maximum 4, sprinkle a little bit of salt on it and let it dry. And as I drive around and a particular scene or creature catches my eye, I simply pull out one of those pieces of paper and paint on top of the prepared ground. And voila, you have an interesting and eye-catching painting that hopefully you can take home and frame.
Thanks so much for sharing, Karen, and so important, I think, to see the quality of Karen's work now, but to hear her say how much she struggled when she started. That alone is such an important point. I get asked about backgrounds all the time, and they are hard. I always struggled, and I still often do struggle with them. What I love about Karen's advice is that it's a wonderful balance of decision making and kind of active participation in the painting, but with a seriously healthy dose of letting go and letting the medium just do its thing. And the effects that Karen gets are so engaging. They are somehow giving the illusion of what is happening, but with a more emotive suggestion of setting rather than being too literal. And I think this suggestion in watercolour, in all painting, can be much more engaging for us as the viewer. It allows us to involve our imaginations and engage our imagination. And in Karen's case, it is also bringing out some of the more unusual qualities of the medium itself. It's kind of playful and exciting, but it's also really refined if we want it to be. Our penultimate artist is a good friend and a very experienced artist. Paul has been painting as well as teaching and inspiring others for longer than he cares to think back, and here's a great little selection of tips.
Hi everybody, my name is Paul Apps, and a very good friend of mine, Tom Shepherd, asked me if I would film a few watercolour tips for you and cram probably as many as I could into a couple of minutes or so. So here goes. The very first one I think is quite important, and that is to plan. Now when it comes to any painting in any media, we do need to have a plan. But it's really, really important with watercolour, because unless you really have worked out ahead of time how you want to execute it, you're going to come unstuck more often than not. When you think of good chess players, now I don't play chess at all, but many good chess players have really worked out their strategies ahead of time. They've actually got you beat before they move their first piece. And it's really the same with watercolour. You really should take the trouble and sit down and work out a plan of action and execution for your watercolour. Take time, think about what you want to do, and think of the way you want to execute it before you actually start mixing colour and applying it to the paper. So that's the first one. Okay, so for the next tip, now let's just look at the palette itself. I've got a well organised palette here. All my colours are set out in the particular colour groups. Now I've gone from earth through darks, blues, greens, reds to yellows. It doesn't really matter which way you do it. The idea is that you have this organisation, because if you do have a situation where you have a pretty low light, you know roughly where your colours are. If you have a confusion over which colours you need to replace at any time, the familiarity that having this sort of organization gives you, it means to say that the whole workflow in the future is so much more easy. And whilst we're on that subject, and the last part of this is to get a little book. This is a little Moleskine watercolor travel book, really. And I've put, this is an old one, so it's got to be updated, but you get the idea. I put all my colors out that appear on my palette, and then what I did is I took the very first color and mixed it as best as I could 50-50 with each of the other colors on the palette. And I then went to the next page and did the same thing with the second color and mixed it with the other colors in the palette. Know exactly what color will work with another color. It will give you some idea, if you mix them, what you'll end up getting. So it really is a great exercise, and it teaches you so much. So with that all said and done, I hope those little tips have helped you. Good luck with your watercolor painting. Take care. All the best. Bye bye.
Thanks, Paul. Be sure to check the description for links to Paul's own YouTube channel. There's some great stuff, an excellent selection of videos, and not all watercolour either. And he was a fascinating guest also on the podcast a few months ago. So planning a painting has come up already, and as Paul said, it's not about necessarily planning everything to the nth degree, but rather really taking the time to study and think about our subject and what it is that we're trying to achieve. And of course we can leave things open to evolution and development, but having a plan of action and an understanding of, say, what light and shadow are doing, plus a good idea of the direction we might want to go in, these are really going to help keep your paintings more decisive and therefore kind of more fresh and bold. As for how to organise your palette and getting to know your colours, yeah, excellent practical tips, so useful. The moment I started consistently laying out my colours, there was an instant improvement in my work. So thanks so much, Paul, a real voice of experience from a lifelong committed artist. So last, but in absolutely no way least, we've got a beautiful video from Jane. I love Jane's use of the medium. It's very different from my own, and it really intrigues me, and to see how it's been born and developed and where Jane has come from was really interesting. I hope this will inspire you all too.
Hi, I'm Jane Davies and I'm a watercolour artist living in West Sussex, England. I specialise in painting pet portraits and wildlife on a commission basis for folks all around the world. I also teach watercolour classes online at Skillshare and in person at a wonderful studio in West Sussex. When Tom got in touch with me and asked me if I'd mind putting this little video together, I thought, what a great idea. So I'm going to share a couple of tips I wish somebody had passed on to me when I just got started. Play and experiment. Get your favourite colours out, a big bowl of water and a sheet of watercolour paper, and simply make a mess. Try popping different amounts of water on your paper and on your brush. Scoop up different amounts of paint and drop them onto the wet paper. Try tilting your paper and letting the whole lot run. Just play around with these combinations. If you have a small mount, it's really interesting to pop it over certain parts of your experiment. It's so much fun, and you'll be amazed at what you learn by simply playing. If you can afford good paints, they are well worth the investment. Equally, experiment with different brands of watercolour paper. You and your style will be drawn to one. Remember, we artists are all on our own journey. Enjoy where you're at. And keep some of your old work. It's so fascinating to look back at them as you progress. I was chuffed with these pieces at the time, but I think you'll agree my style has changed. Last little tip, only paint what you're drawn to and don't let other people tell you otherwise. So I hope some of these tips helped.
There we go, a wonderful, fun and carefree attitude of play and experimentation. I think it's such a great tip. It will always keep you inspired and intrigued simply by the medium itself. And as you can see, the understanding and effects that this approach has given Jane's current work is just beautiful. And to round off with really just appreciating and enjoying the uniqueness of our own artistic journeys wherever we are at on them is such a wonderful final bit of advice for this video. Thanks so much, Jane. And again, thank you so much to all of the artists that contributed to this video, and thank you to all of you for watching. If you enjoyed this, please do consider subscribing and don't forget to hit the notification button for all future videos. Please feel free to share this with others you think may enjoy it, and for those that are interested, I do also have a Patreon teaching channel for exclusive tutorials, time lapses, live streams and a whole load of other stuff. I also host a podcast which I mentioned a couple of times. The links to all of this stuff are in the description. Until next time, happy creating, happy painting, and I will catch you in the next video.